To begin with, all I'm going to do is to separate the yolk from the white. So I'm going to get rid of the white completely, and that can just be discarded. And then with the yolk sac hopefully still intact, it will often stay intact as long as the eggs are quite fresh. If it's quite an old egg, you'll find it breaks a little bit. And for kind of experimenting and things, it doesn't really matter if a bit of white goes in. But the reason you do this rolling around on a paper towel is to roll off all the white so that you're only getting that kind of fat part of the egg. And if you're an absolute purist as well, you'd even take the sac out, just pierce the sac and then put the remains of the yolk into a jar. But I'm fine with a bit of sac in there because I'm just going to be painting quite loosely now. So that's my egg yolk, and these are the possible pigments I could mix into it. Any water-based pigment, so like gouache, which is in a tube form, watercolour, which is quite similar, and also in a tube. If you've got watercolour pans, you know, when they're in the little boxes, that's more difficult. You'd probably have to work that up with some water and a brush into a kind of paste, and then add that to a palette with egg yolk. So that would be more difficult. And then some ink. I mean, that's actually liquid concentrate watercolour, but it could be any ink, any pigment at all, or the traditional way, which would be dry pigments. And if I keep my egg yolk in a little jar with a lid, I can keep the lid on and use it over the course of probably a day, ideally, not a really long time. And especially if you keep the lid on and keep it in the fridge, it will last slightly longer. So I'll start with the watercolour and how I would make that into egg tempera, squeezing out a small amount onto the palette. And then because the egg dries so fast, I'm only ever going to mix up a small amount at a time. So just like a little bit of egg yolk and a little bit of watercolour. And essentially this is like a glaze, so the more egg yolk I add in, the thinner it will be, and the more pigment I add in, the thicker it will be. And I can just take a brush and just test that out on my paper. And I'll test it out with a little bit more watercolour in it as well, a little bit thicker. Now you can see when I do that these marks are almost completely dry already. So it's really drying within quite a few seconds, and that it's preserving the marks that I'm putting down. So once I've put down something, you know, this kind of shape, it will remember. It's not like an oil painting where you can go back in and then change all of those marks. Once those are down, those are down. But there's something that can be very useful about that. It preserves the brush marks as you make them, and that can be part of its kind of unique quality in a way. And you can see if I go back over the top of those, you know, that's already pretty dry. So I've got to commit to what's there, but I can layer up over the top and have marks going in opposite directions and so on. I've laid out now some ink and some pigment, so it's exactly the same principle. I'm just going to add in a tiny bit of ink into the egg yolk, and I'll try a bit of a different brush mark now. A little bit more of a dry brush, looking at those kind of textures. And then adding in a little bit more ink. and getting that slightly darker mark. And I could again add a little bit more ink and maybe only using the egg yolk that's on the palette already to achieve a much darker add a little bit more in. And then of course when you're working in colour you can start to overlay one colour over another, and because of that transparent, translucent quality of the tempera, the colours will interact. You'll get a kind of interaction of two colours. This is black on blue, so I'm kind of expecting it'll go a kind of dark grey blue. But there's really so much you can play with the kind of texture and handling of the tempera before you get into anything to do with that kind of overlying colour. And finally I've got this little bit of pigment. There's a bit of water on the brush as well, and you can add a few drops of water into the tempera as well as a medium to kind of make it more fluid. If I'm working in a sketchbook on thin paper, which is not particularly advisable, I try not to add much water at all, just so that the paper can stay fairly flat. So I'm going to add in a little bit more egg yolk into that mix. I haven't chosen colours that particularly interact well together for this. These are just kind of examples of those three different ways of adding pigment into the tempera, but you can see a little bit the interaction of the colours as they overlay each other, but hopefully most of all the potential to play with the way that the egg yolk changes the handling of the pigment or the watercolour. And you can see it's already pretty much dry on the palette there, so you're going to be mixing up little bits as you go along and then mixing up more. It's not a process where you're mixing up loads and loads of one colour.